Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. Today in all four of our readings, we read about things that can be connected to the idea of suffering. In the Old Testament, we read that suffering has a purpose. In the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 4, it talks about the fact that everything happens for a reason. And included in that would be suffering. And in our reading in 2 Samuel, then also in Psalms, we see specific examples of how suffering can accomplish a particular purpose. We see in the 2 Samuel reading that David encountered suffering because of his sin and for the sake of discipline. David had committed adultery with Bathsheba. He had her husband killed in battle. And the Lord said that the sword would never depart from his house, and also his own son was going to die. And David experienced that heartbreaking experience of watching his child suffer for 7 days and then eventually die. But again, this was for the purpose of disciplining David and keeping him on the right path. And then in Psalms, in our reading in Psalms, in Psalm 119, we read that the sufferings that the psalmist had endured brought him back to God's precepts. And so it had the purpose of building character in him and causing him to appreciate God's law. And so in our Old Testament readings in Proverbs, also 2 Samuel, and Psalm 119, we all see that suffering has a purpose. But in our New Testament reading in John 16, we actually see how to deal with suffering. It's one thing to recognize and to know that suffering has a purpose in our lives, and that's good to know. It helps us to hold on to faith even in the times of suffering. But it's a whole other thing to know how to deal with sufferings when we are encountering them, and that's what John 16 does for us. So that's the chapter I want to focus on in our devotion today. Jesus was speaking to his disciples the night before he himself was going to suffer and die on the cross. And he gives them some instructions, some help on how to deal with the various sufferings that they would endure. They were going to endure external suffering. He says in verse 2, "They will make you outcasts in the synagogue, but an hour is coming for everyone who kills you to think that he is offering service to God." Physically, the apostles were going to endure some pretty heavy suffering. But internally as well, they dealt with suffering, and they were already beginning to feel that. As mentioned in verse 6, he says, "But because I said these things to you, sorrow has filled your heart." So they had suffered in the sense of feeling sorrow because of the things that Christ had spoken to them. Well, how were they to deal with these various sufferings? Well, for one, they were to remember the things that Jesus had told them. In verse 1 it says, "These things I have spoken to you so that you may be kept from stumbling." You'll keep from losing your faith. You'll keep from stumbling because of these words that I have spoken to you. And the words that he had spoken to them trace back to chapter 15, where he talked about his own sufferings and ties that to them. He says in verse 18, "If the world hates you, you know that it has hated me before it hated you." And Peter borrows from this in his epistle in 1 Peter, where he too is speaking to a church that was suffering, and time again he brings them back to the sufferings of Christ, that Christ had left them an example of how to suffer and still stay committed to God. And Jesus here is showing his apostles and showing us as well just how important it is for us to remember that our own King, the Messiah that we follow, the Christ, he too suffered. And that's something to remember. So when we're suffering, we can look back on and think about the fact that the very one who we are following has called us to take up our cross and follow him, because he has first taken up the cross himself. And to bear the cross for him, to remember that he too has suffered, and to be emboldened with that in the forefront of our minds, and to go into the suffering remembering that very fact. But then also he helps them by showing them that suffering is temporary. In verse 20, he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will grieve, but listen to this, but your grief will be turned into joy." And then he goes on to describe in verse 21 this idea of a woman in labor. Of course, labor is a very painful thing, and she experiences this pain because her hour has come, he says. But then when she gives birth to the child, she no longer remembers the pain because of the joy that a child has been born. That pain that she experiences for the hour is very intense and very difficult, but it's forgotten once that beautiful child is born. And Jesus here is showing them that, yeah, you're going to be sorrowful. You're going to see me suffer on the cross, but you're going to see me again. And that sorrow that you're feeling as you're having to say goodbye to me on the cross is going to be forgotten for the joy that you're going to have when you see me again. And so this shows us that sufferings are temporary. Theirs were going to be temporary because of the situation, but ours too are always temporary. Now, how temporary they are might vary depending on what we're going through. Some may only last a day, some may only last an hour, some may last a week, some may last for the rest of our lives. But no matter how long the suffering lasts in this life, it's temporary because this life is temporary. And one day we'll see Christ, and we'll be so joyful and so full of exaltation that the sorrow, the difficulty, the hardship we experience in this life will almost be as though it is forgotten for the joy that we're experiencing then. And so we can make it and endure it through sufferings when we realize that it's temporary. When we think we're stuck in the sufferings forever, it can be very difficult to deal with. But when we realize that, hey, I'm dealing with it today, I might even have to deal with it tomorrow, but one day I'll be alleviated from this suffering and enjoy all the bliss that the Lord has planned for me. And then also to realize that in Jesus is the peace. This is found in verse 33. He says, "These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world." Notice the contrast here. He says that in me you may have peace. In the world you'll have tribulation. And we have this experience where we're both in Christ, but we're also in the world. We're not of the world, as he'll talk about in chapter 17. We're not of the world, but we're in the world. And Christ says that you'll have these two different experiences. You'll have in the world, you'll be experiencing tribulation. But in me, you will experience peace. You will have peace. And so we can make it through these times of trials and difficulties by realizing, you know what? Yes, in the world I am suffering, but in Christ I find peace. And as we draw closer to him, as we worship him, as we love him, as we keep our hearts and our eyes fixed on him, then we experience the peace of Christ that he can offer, to where we are in the experience of the disciples in the boat. When the storm was raging, when it seemed as though they were going to be destroyed in the storm, and they go down into the ship and they find Jesus asleep, just peaceful, a picture of peace in the midst of the storm. And when we are drawn close to him, when we're living in communion with him and fellowship with him, we can borrow from that peace that he has, even though outwardly there may be a storm raging around us. And so these are ways that we can deal with suffering. We can remember that Christ himself suffered and be encouraged by that. We can remember that sufferings are temporary, and we can also remember that in Christ we can find peace, even in the midst of tribulation, even in the midst of difficulty. So let's reflect on this. If anyone is going through a time where you're dealing with suffering, cling to these words. But even if you're not, we can hold on to these things and store them up in our minds, so that in the day that we do suffer, in the time in which we do suffer, we can recall them back to our minds and remember that Christ has given us some teachings, some instructions on how to deal with sufferings in these various ways. So let's think about that today as we do our reading. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.